pleasure right now to be sitting with Tavis Smiley, the author of Death of a King, the real story of Dr. Martin Luther King's final year. Welcome.
Good to see you, Rich. You good?
I see you too. Doing great.
Good.
Really glad to have you.
Honored to be here.
This book was really eye-opening for me. As I read it, there were a lot of things that I've learned about Martin Luther King, certainly, and even my kids are learning different things about Martin Luther King than I learned about Martin Luther King. But I didn't know what a tough final year all around it was for Dr. King.
I regard Dr. King, Rich, as the greatest democratic, small d, the greatest democratic public intellectual the country's ever created. To my mind, he may even be the greatest American we've ever produced. I could debate you on FDR, I could debate you on Lincoln, a lot of great Americans. But to my mind, he's certainly America's greatest democratic public intellectual because he had the courage and the conviction and the commitment and, quite frankly, the character to speak the kinds of inconvenient, uncomfortable truths that people didn't want to hear, even though they needed to be told. So the story is, as you mentioned, the story of the last year of his life. King gives I Have a Dream speech in 1963. He's dead too young at the age of 39 in 68, but he does live 5 years after I Have a Dream. So we got to get beyond this notion of thinking that King only gave one speech in his life,
Right.
and the speech only had one line in it, that I want my children to live in a nation where they'll not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. That's all we know about King. But over that 5 years, he evolves, he morphs, he grows, he matures over the last 5 years of his life. And this story of the last year of his life is a story that most Americans don't know. And when you try to juxtapose the way we have deified him in death with the way he was literally demonized in the last year of his life, we have a hard time trying to square those two.
And demonized not just by the group you would expect, which is white Southerners or angry, people who didn't appreciate Dr. King's message, but by black Americans as well.
Yeah, demonized by everybody. So April 4, 67, he goes to New York City, to the Riverside Church in the Upper West Side. And at the Riverside Church, he gives a speech called Beyond Vietnam. And this is the speech that is the most controversial of his entire life. So in this Beyond Vietnam speech, he calls America, one, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. That's a damning indictment. The greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. And then he goes on in that speech to advance this notion of what he calls the triple threat facing our democracy. King argues, Rich, that if we don't get serious about this triple threat facing our democracy, we're just going to lose our democracy. That triple threat, racism, poverty, and militarism. So he tells America, if you don't get serious, America, about racism, poverty, and militarism, you're going to lose your democracy. But then he tells America again that you, America, are the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today as he comes out forcefully against the war in Vietnam. So King gives this speech, and the next day, all hell breaks loose. So literally, from April 4, 67, when he gives this speech, Beyond Vietnam, to 1 year to the day later, April 4, 68, when they assassinate him, this story is the story of that last literal 12 months of his life and what happens to him once he gives that speech. And pardon my English, it ain't pretty.
You write it in the present tense the whole time, and you refer to him in a way that I'd never referred to him, Doc.
Yeah.
But it's always about, as we're going through the year, we're living that year and those days with him, and we're talking about Doc is doing this and Doc is doing that. Where does the Doc come from?
All of his friends and colleagues called him Doc. His staff called him Doc, and I wanted to take him off that pedestal, kind of humanize him. I argue in the text that I think that King's martyrdom has really undermined his message. His martyrdom has undermined his message. We get so caught up in the assassination part that we, again, haven't come to terms with what set him up for assassination. And the short story is that when you abandon somebody, the way that King was abandoned, you abandon them and then you isolate them, sort of give them the Heisman, So you abandon them, then you isolate them. It makes it easy for somebody else to assassinate them. And that's what happens to King. So when he gives this speech Beyond Vietnam, here's what happens over the last year of his life. He gives this speech, and immediately the media turns against him. Now, pardon my English again, we ain't talking Fox News. Fox News wasn't around then. You can imagine the field day that Fox News would have had when King calls America the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. They would have been all over him like a cheap suit. So we're not talking Fox News. We're talking the liberal New York Times, the liberal Washington Post. We're talking Time Magazine. When you read in this text what these liberal media outlets said about King, it's embarrassing. It's shameful all these years later to see the language they employed in talking about King because he came out against the war in Vietnam and basically called America on the carpet. So the media turns on him first, then the White House turns on him. He and Johnson have worked together, excuse me, he and President Johnson worked together to pass the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. But now King is going tete-a-tete, Rich, with him on the war in Vietnam. And Johnson doesn't like that. So the media turns on him, and then the White House turns on him, and then white America turns on him. The last poll taken in his life, the Harris poll, found that nearly 3/4, 75% of the American people thought he was irrelevant. And almost 60% of black people, to your earlier point, his own people, almost 60% of us thought that he was persona non grata. When I say us, I mean Roy Wilkins and the NAACP publicly against Dr. King. Whitney Young and the Urban League. I can't even quote on television what Thurgood Marshall, yes, that Thurgood Marshall, what he said about Dr. King. Adam Clayton Powell Jr., Ralph Bunche. I mean, the entire black elite, the black glitterati, turns against Dr. King, and that's at this level. For the everyday black people, they're over Dr. King because the Black Power thing is coming on. And they'd rather hear Stokely Carmichael than Dr. King. So the media turns on him, the White House turns on him, white folk turn on him, black folk turn on him, and inside his own organization, SCLC, they pass a resolution to condemn him for speaking out against the war in Vietnam. So his own organization turns against him. So he's in the last year of his life, he has no constituency. Nobody's really standing with him as he's talking about this triple threat and trying to get this poor people's campaign off the ground. King is basically isolated, and he's alone, and that leads ultimately to his assassination.
You talk about the price you pay as a truth teller.
Yeah.
Did he ever lose hope himself? I mean, what all the kids learn in school is this optimist in the face of constant oppression. Did he lose hope in that last year?
It is the case, to your point about being a truth teller, it is the case. And my friend Cornel West, who appeared here at this festival, has said many times in one way, shape, or fashion, I agree with Dr. West on this, that there's a high price to pay for speaking the truth. There's a greater price to pay for living a lie. And King didn't want to live a lie. Now, was that easy to your question, Rich? No, it wasn't easy. The book talks about his depression, his despondency. When King was just a kid, 12 years of age, I won't give the story away in detail, but King tried to kill himself when he was 12. When you think about Dr. King, you don't think of a guy who's a 12-year-old kid trying to commit suicide. So the story, the book is told in the story is told in the book, rather, of King trying to kill himself at the age of 12. So he always had this sort of death complex, even when he was a kid. And that followed him throughout his life. But then, there's a book coming out next year about King. It's going to be very, very controversial, about Tufts University professor, who's really trying to do the first psychoanalysis of King. You ask, how can you psychoanalyze somebody 50 years after their death almost? But he's done some interesting work looking at King's hospital records, et cetera, which we touch on in this text. But King suffered from mania. So he's depressed, he's despondent. So here's his life the last year. Everybody, everything is turned against you. You have to feel like the cosmos has sort of shifted against you. Your own organization, you can't get to work with you on the Poor People's Campaign, and they pass a resolution to condemn you. You know there's a bullet out there with your name on it. The death threats are, voluminous. We just saw the New York Times released just a few days ago the official letter. I referenced the letter in the text. I'd seen parts of the letter, but the New York Times literally just released all these years later that somebody, stumbled upon an actual copy of a letter that FBI and the CIA, the FBI rather, sent to Dr. King, telling him he might as well just kill himself. This is the FBI sending King a letter saying to him, you might as well just kill yourself, dude. We're gonna get you. You're not gonna get out of here alive. You might as well just kill yourself. When you see that, you can go online and read it now. It's online. When you read what the FBI wrote to him, this isn't just surveillance. This isn't just wiretapping. They did all of that, but they're encouraging the guy to kill himself. So this is the hell and the hate coming at him every single day. And somehow he's got to navigate his way through that. Back to your question, how does he do that? He prays himself through it. He pulls himself through it. He pushes himself through it. He cries himself through it. There's stories in the book, one story in particular. King wakes up one morning, gets fully dressed, fully clothed, hat, back in the day, suit, hat, tie, everything. Can't get out the door because that despondency is so heavy on his heart. That burden is weighing on him. He can't get out the door, Rich. He turns back around, goes back, and gets back in the bed, fully clothed. Hat, shoes, suit, everything, pulls the cover over his head and just cries and cries and cries until he eventually falls asleep. In the last year of his life, there's some folk in his inner circle who were trying to get him to go see a therapist. He would not dare do it. He wouldn't see a therapist because he knew that Hoover would take that information, and on top of calling him a communist and anti-American and all the other stuff, then they're going to call you crazy, for seeing a therapist. So he knew what the end result of that was. So he and Belafonte talked about it many times, because Belafonte was seeing a therapist and had kind of recommended his guy to King. King wouldn't do it. But anyway, it's just a fascinating story of how you get up every day with all of that coming at you and still try to tell the truth.
Yeah, you never think of Martin Luther King crying about his own condition. After all these years, though, he receives, that next plateau.
Yeah.
I mean, he is deified. I mean, he's now, there's holidays and there's every child knows the I Have a Dream speech.
Yeah.
But you argue that that hasn't been good for his legacy,
No.
and that in fact it's undercut it. And this book would seem to indicate that.
It has indeed. To your point, holiday, postage stamp, monument in Washington, name on schools and streets and libraries. To your point, he's everywhere now. He's ubiquitous these days. President Obama has a bust of him sitting in the Oval Office. So again, as I said earlier, we have deified him in death, but haven't come to terms yet with the real message he was trying to get us to deal with. So almost 50 years after his assassination, if King were here today, Rich, he'd still be talking about that same triple threat that he talked about then. What do we see in Ferguson, Missouri? Racism, poverty, and militarism. And so were he here, I've been asked many times how he would feel about Barack Obama as president, first black president. Well, the answer is, I think, pretty simple. And the evidence is in the book because he went to Cleveland to campaign assiduously to help elect the first black mayor of Cleveland, Carl Stokes. Although the night Carl Stokes got elected, he dissed Dr. King on national television. That's another story you read in the book about what he did to King after King helped his brother get elected. He turns on him publicly because he don't even want to be seen standing in a picture with Dr. King. King is so toxic that black elected officials don't even want to be seen photographed next to the guy in the last year. Imagine that. We can't imagine King being here today. There wouldn't be a line everywhere to people taking selfies with Dr. King. They didn't want to be seen with Dr. King.
Yeah.
So in the last year of his life, again, he's trying to get up every day and trying to tell these truths. They were uncomfortable, they were inconvenient, they were unhousing then, and they're still the same way now. So here now, he would certainly have campaigned for Obama, voted for Obama, and then he would have become Obama's chief critic. And he'd still be taking him and the entire body politic to task on that triple threat of racism, poverty, and militarism. So as long as we get caught up in the dreaminess and the martyrdom and never come to terms with his message, then we're not ever fully going to appreciate who he was.
You brought it up a couple of times. This is about, obviously, this whole theme of Dr. King's life and the last year of his life has been something that's been working in your head for a long time. But you brought it up a couple of times now, that social media and all the elements that today and the Fox News or the other networks too, the constant 24 stream, how can a person like Dr. King emerge today? How can someone lead us through things like Ferguson and other things when you have an entirely different media setup?
It's a powerful question, Rich. And let me just, I always make a distinction between optimism and hope. I'm not an optimistic person, I'm a hopeful person. Optimism suggests there's a particular set of facts or circumstances, conditions, something you can see, feel, or touch that gives you reason to believe that things are going to get better. That's not my existence. I'm a hopeful person. I'm always a prisoner of hope. I believe you can build, I'm Exhibit A, you can build a whole life on hope. So even the evidence doesn't suggest that things are going to work out for you. You can always be a hopeful person, even if you're not optimistic. So I say that as a prelude to your question. I am not optimistic about how a king might have broken through. There's always the hope that he could have broken through. But the bottom line is this, that the media and the country, I think, writ large these days, has moved beyond being skeptical to being cynical. They questioned authority back then. King was part of a movement that questioned authority, rightly so, on the Vietnam War. All these years later, King was right, everybody else was wrong. But skepticism is one thing, cynicism another. We live in such a cynical society now, number one. I don't know that King could have broken through. Number two, there's a huge price to pay for being a truth teller. You get everybody turned against you. I'm no king and ain't trying to be, never will be. But in my own life, just in the last 7 years, trying to hold Obama accountable. So all my white progressive friends can raise critical questions about this president and holding him accountable. When I do that, every Negro's mad at me. I'm persona non grata in black America for just raising questions about accountability. You can't say nothing about the black president. So when you try to tell the truth, they turn on you. And then you're up against cynicism, which is different than skepticism, as I